Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to wait a couple more minutes before we get started to allow everyone to access the link and join us.
Rose just wanted to check if you saw Angenique's message that she might not be seeing everything she was able to see on the previous webinar.
All right, I think we can get started. People are still trickling in, but we only have 60 minutes for this session, so maybe we can slowly get started. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you here for the launch of a fantastic treasure trove of practical resources, information on advancing women's digital and financial inclusion. And you are among the first ones to see this playbook. It's the UNCDF Inclusive Digital Economies and Gender Equality Playbook. And my colleague just dropped the link into the chat. And I'm saying you're among the first ones to see it because we had an earlier session earlier this morning with our colleagues from a different time zone. So this is our second session today, and we're really excited to have you here. My name is Diana Deja. I am FinEquity's facilitator, and I will be moderating the session today. And for those of you who are not familiar with FinEquity, we are a community of practice focused on advancing women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion, convened by CGAP at the World Bank. We currently reach over 2,500 individuals in our community, and we are thrilled to partner with UNCDF on the launch of this amazing resource. And on the next slide, you can see that you can see the agenda. So what's the plan for this session? We will be having opening remarks and a little bit on the context of the playbook from my colleague Antonique at CGAP. We will then show you what's the best way to access the playbook, how it works, what are the different sections, really how to get the most out of it. And Nandini will be doing that. Then we'll move on. We'll have a participatory exercise. In fact, I should say that we have a few participatory exercises in store for you. So please stay tuned, pay maximum attention at all times because you don't want to be surprised. Just kidding. But we want to engage our audience as well during today's session. So we'll do that before we hear from an example in Sierra Leone who will really illustrate how the playbook comes to life. And our colleague Wycliffe will share that. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A session and then closing remarks. So I would like to invite everyone while we go through the presentations, through the different sections, to post any questions or comments that you may have in the chat. And then at the end, I will go through them and direct them to the different panelists and speakers, and we'll answer those questions live, as many as we can in the time that we have available. As I said, I am joined today by a great group of speakers. On the next slide, I will just briefly mention who they are, because I asked them to introduce themselves when they speak. So you'll hear more about their role as they start speaking. But we have with us today, we have Antonique, who's the gender lead at SIGA, myself, Nandini, who is senior advisor with UNCDF for Inclusive Digital Economies, and Wycliffe, who is the country lead for Sierra Leone. And before we dive into the content, as I said, let's kick off our first exercise with the audience. We would like to try to set the tone for today's session by imagining a future in which women are equal actors in inclusive digital economies. What would that future look like? So we would like to invite you to join us at slido.com. On the screen, you see a QR code. You can use your phone camera to access that. There is also a link to the poll in the chat. You can access this through the link. And I would like to invite you to just tell us in 1, 2, or 3 words, what does that future look like in your opinion? And maybe Rose, we can switch to the Slido app to see how those words come together. And if we cannot switch, I can take a look.
To ask you to present that and share on screen, if that's okay.
Okay, let's see. Sure, let's see how I do that. All right.
I'm happy to do it.
Yes, let's do it, Nandini, because my Zoom. But I can say far ahead.
Can you see it? Diana, can you see it on my screen?
Yeah,
can you see it on my screen? Great.
Yes, perfect. Independence, wealthy and just, dynamic, peace, equal access to digital technologies, new opportunities. Nobody's saying that we will be out of our jobs, but maybe that's also what happens when this future is realized. Far ahead, empowering. Okay, many people are saying empowering, which is really inspiring, and I think we have the same vision. So we really hope that this playbook, the wealth of resources included, the tools included in the playbook, coupled with the collective power within the Finequity community, you can lean on these tools to get to this future, and we should be able to realize this future not so far ahead. I think quite a few of us think it's far in the future, but hopefully not, with all of the things that we now have available. And maybe, let's see, are there any more entries? If not, maybe we can. Thank you. Equal, fair, just, empowering. I think those are amazing words to describe the kind of future that we want to see sooner rather than later. So thank you for participating in this first exercise. And without any further ado, I would like to invite my colleague Antonique to share a few opening remarks and the context for the playbook. Thank you, Antonique.
Thanks very much, Diana, and thank you all for joining today. And it is a special day because today the Generation Equality Forum is launching in Paris. It's not too far from me. And so we're delighted that we have an opportunity to focus on what it actually means and how this can be playing out in practice. So for those of you who haven't heard of the Generation Equality Forum yet, it's a civil society-centered, multi-stakeholder and global gathering that is focusing on gender equality. It's convened by UN Women and co-hosted by the governments of Mexico and France, but it's also a partnership of many civil society organizations, youth, and they all together seek to address inequality issues, and not only talk about it. And I think that's the most important. Many of the organizations that have come together under this forum are making commitments on gender equality and specifically on women's financial equality. So we know those commitments are really important and really valuable, but they need to be translated into action. And that, I think, is the opportunity we have today. At Finequity, we are really concerned about making sure that practices change in the field on the ground and really make women's lives better. And that is also the objective that UNCDF has. And Nandini will share a little bit more about these commitments and the areas, how they connect with the work that we have today. But I think the playbook that we're presenting to you today is a great opportunity to find solutions to constraints that we're all facing in the work that we do. And Finequity, as the community of practice, has been contributing to this playbook. We've helped to crowdsource examples, ideas, and also provided feedback on it. And we think that Finequity, with its network with more than 2,500 people that we reach, can also be a great way to further disseminate the ideas that are part of the playbook. So I just invite you to not just sit back, but listen carefully to the approach that UNCDF has taken specifically here in Sierra Leone to some of the constraints that women are facing in their financial inclusion, and how the playbook can actually help you, inspire you with ideas of how to solve some of these issues. So I'm very much looking forward to listening today and to also hearing all of your reactions. So with that, I'll give it back to Diana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonique. Very, very inspiring and great context for how we came to be today, what the session is all about. And Nandini, please take the floor, walk us through the playbook and the history of how UNCDF put it together, and any other information that would be helpful for our participants to learn today. And also just to reiterate that Nandini will share a lot of great information. So please, if you have any questions, just drop it in the chat and I will make sure to go through them and then save some time at the end to answer them. Thank you, Nandini.
Thank you, Diana. I'm so pleased to be here today. I'm so pleased to be launching the playbook alongside Antonique and Diana. We've been working on the playbook for more than a year now. And it first started as a tool internally, but we received so much feedback from stakeholders like Antonique and Diana and others that this would be a useful tool to a broader set of audience, that we're pleased to be presenting it today. I'm Nandini Harihareshwara. I'm the lead gender focal point or senior advisor for the Inclusive Digital Economies Division of UNCDF. And it's my pleasure today to be presenting to you a little bit about UNCDF and a little bit about why we're presenting this playbook and this tool, as Janique said, at this really amazing, interesting time of the Generation Equality Forum and their forum in Paris this week. Rose, can I ask you to pull up the slides? So my job is big to try to do within a small time frame, but I'll do my best. I will introduce a little bit about UNCDF for anyone that might not know about them. I'll talk a little bit about our framework, which is how we built the playbook framework and our approach on making women builders of digital economies. And then I'll get into the good stuff, which is what is the playbook, how does it work, and how do you use it? So very quickly, UNCDF is a small UN agency that focuses our work in mostly least developed countries and about 28 in our inclusive digital economies practice. And our vision is to promote digital economies that leave no one behind. We have close relationships with public sector, private sector, and civil society actors in most of the countries that we work in. Next slide, please. As I said, we have a framework by which we try to create and co-create inclusive digital economies. And that framework is also what we use to develop the playbook. So that's one of the reasons I'm introducing it here. It has 4 work streams. One is skills. We want to make sure that the end customers and clients that we're trying to benefit in building inclusive economies have the skills to actually be empowered through the products and services that are built and could be built. Second is innovation. Are the innovations that are being created in the country actually addressing the needs of marginalized populations, especially women? Third is infrastructure. So do things like access to mobile phones, energy, internet, as well as digital payments actually address the needs? Are they accessible to marginalized populations and closing the gender gap? And are they actually meeting the needs of marginalized populations, especially women? Lastly, but definitely not leastly, is policy and regulation. Working with our government partners, trying to understand whether or not there is a strong enough enabling environment to address some of the challenges that we see in the other work streams, as well as trying to accomplish the vision with our government partners on what they would like their inclusive digital economies to look like. So this is our framework. Next slide, please. So specifically for gender, our goal is to build inclusive digital economies with our stakeholders that reduce poverty, increase resilience, and improve economic opportunities for women. Next slide. We have a 5-pronged approach to try to help make women builders of inclusive digital economies. First is we want to decrease the gender digital divide. Second is we want to solve problems for women with digital and financial products. Third is lower barriers for women MSMEs via technology. Fourth is supporting policymakers to increase women's digital and financial autonomy. And lastly is to co-create a gender inclusive digital economy, leadership, and labor force. Next slide. Antonique, sorry, I think we skipped a couple of slides on Generation Equality Forum, but I'll just say we were announced to be co-leaders of Generation Equality Forum last year, and it's been an honor and a privilege to work with a really incredibly invested group of organizations who are very interested in not just making commitments, but actually taking those commitments to action. And so what UNCDF's commitment to the Generation Equality Forum, our Executive Secretary, Preeti Sinha, will be announcing tomorrow, so I don't want to get ahead of her. But what is also very important to us, and the reason we've launched this playbook today, is you'll be hearing many commitments announced in the next 3 days around gender equality and women's economic empowerment by a group of stakeholders. What we want to make sure that we continue to be committed to is taking those commitments to action. And we feel this inclusive digital economies and gender playbook helps us do that. Now, what is the playbook? Maybe that's one of the first questions to answer, right? And who is it for, right? So first, it started as a tool for UNCDF team members to help build capacity. When I worked in Zambia, I wished I had a playbook, using kind of a sports analogy, on what are the different interventions that can help me address the market constraints that I know exist on the ground for women. And so we set out to try to build one. But as we built it, we realized it's also a tool for other development practitioners working on women's economic empowerment. And it's also helpful to development partners trying to understand the field and potential interventions of the market development approach. We hope that the playbook is a practical how-to guide to help transform women into builders of emerging digital economies. We know, after lots of vetting, that it brings together a wealth of research and good practices from leading organizations. And it identifies common constraints faced by women, but we know that it's not exhaustive, right? We just try to pick the ones that we see across many of the countries that we've done diagnostics in. And then it suggests concrete examples of interventions that can address those constraints. We also hope that it's a living document. So we look for crowdsourced information. This is a field that moves quickly. So good practice can change. And so as that changes, we hope this document can be updated at some frequency with all of your feedback and suggestions. Next slide, please. So how to use the playbook. So it starts, if you're like skimming it or glancing at it, Sophie's been kind enough to post it every few minutes. Thanks for the shout out, Anne, by the way. It starts with cheat sheets, right? Like maybe you, are getting started in this field and you just want to understand some of the basics. So we tried to create what we call cheat sheets to help you understand some of the basics and some of the challenges that women face at a broader level and some background information. Then it goes into research and diagnostics. It has a treasure trove. This is a term Deanna was using in the last webinar, of information, both secondary data that already exists on a variety of topics related to women and gender gaps, and tools to do your own primary research. So once you go through that information, if you don't already know your market constraints, you then hopefully know some number of market constraints to the issues you're trying to address. Then you go into the 4 work streams that I mentioned before. And so based on the market constraints in those work streams, next slide, please, you can see, here's a summary, a snapshot from our playbook on the infrastructure work stream. And so here's 6 common market constraints that we identified: IDs, mobile phone ownership, internet access, etc. So let's say you choose one of them. Next slide, please. You might choose, I want to work on increasing mobile phone ownership for women. How do I do that? We actually have 12 interventions. We didn't put both pages in because we just wanted to give you a snapshot. We have 12 intervention suggestions and examples for each one that show how you might do it. And they're at least great first stages to think through what is it exactly that this intervention is, how has it been done in one or more other countries, and sometimes we're even able to provide an excellent guide, a reference guide that has multiple examples and multiple sort of how-tos. So for anyone considering any of these market constraints, it's quite useful to them. Next slide, please. So with that, we are going to go into a participatory exercise, again, using Slido. So I think Sophie will put up, yes, she just put up the new link. What are some of the constraints women currently face with respect to innovation? And UNCDF's definition of that work stream is really focused on are all of the innovations happening really helping women, right? And that can go into women entrepreneurs, that can talk about women's entrepreneurs engagement with innovation. There's a lot of different ways that we can think about that. It's an open question. And so maybe we'll go to the, Rose, do you need me to go to the link and share it with everyone?
I think that would be helpful.
I'll be sharing that now.
Oh,
Okay.
you can. Great.
Great. So if you can go to Slido and just put in some suggestions you would have, anything that comes to mind, how do you get more women involved in innovation? How do you get more innovations in a country to actually be addressing the needs and constraints of women and women entrepreneurs? What are some of the constraints that women face with respect to innovation? Yeah, social norms is a big piece of it. That's something that the FinEquity team and we and others are working on to do diagnostics around. Yes, social norms has a lot of votes there. Yeah, access to finance, that's right. Women should be leading the innovations. I really like that. Access to capital, so that's also access to finance. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of really good answers here. And the framework that we create is just a framework. The thing is, we all know in development, we all know in the work that we do, all of these interventions, all of these market constraints actually cut across all of these work streams, right? It's a kind of a false construct, but at least it's a framework to kind of work from, right? That's great. Are not visible to innovators. I really like that. Not considered profitable customers. That's right. And that was part of your debunking myths session, Deanna. You and Antonique did, you and your team did some time ago. Childcare burdens, absolutely. Insufficient understanding of women's constraints. This is so great. Yeah. Deanna, is there anything in here that is particular, surprise to you, or anything you'd want to pick out and say anything about?
I think I'm spotting a category that is, related to capabilities. I guess the low literacy, lack of education. I saw a few more that relate to women's financial and digital capabilities. And just to shout out that in the playbook, UNCDF included a recent synthesis of digital financial literacy interventions focused on a few enablers of women's digital financial literacy. So I invite everyone to check that out, because it's really relevant for many of the constraints that women are facing, but especially related to innovation, because a lot of the innovation happens in the digital space.
Agree. In the chat, there's also relevance, which kind of goes to, whether this is actually relevant for women. These are great. We're going to keep these and we will share them with everyone, but thank you for participating in this. I think at this point, we'll switch back to the deck, and I want to give a quick snapshot of the playbook, just what Deanna just said. So she knows our playbook well. Thank you, Deanna. These are the 4 market constraints, the common ones, right? It's not exhaustive, specific to our innovation workstream. Right? 1 is digital and financial products don't meet the needs of women and girls. 2nd is limited access to finance for women-led enterprises. 3rd is poor entrepreneurship skills connected to innovation. And lastly, poor access to digital business tools and digital platforms. I do want to give a shout out for our webinar with our Asia Pacific colleagues earlier today. We covered some of this ground, both with the amazing country lead for PNG, Jagdeep Dahiya, and Maria Perdomo, our regional lead for Asia. Both talked about several of these, and specifically Maria's program in Bangladesh. She was inviting people to give feedback on how to increase women entrepreneur access to online platforms. So I thought that was great. And if people have things to add, please do send them to us, and we're happy to share them on with our colleagues. I'm very happy and delighted to give it the stage back to Deanna, who will be leading the next session.
Thank you, Nandini. And just to mention that we have recorded the earlier session, so everyone on this session can access the recording as soon as it's available, and you can listen into Maria's and Jagdeep's presentations. It was really, really interesting. But equally interesting will be our next presentation and contribution from Wycliffe. Thank you so much for joining us. This is really a specific example. We're going to go through a specific example from Sierra Leone, who, as I said in the beginning, will hopefully bring the playbook to life a little bit more for the participants. So Wycliffe, thank you so much again for joining. And maybe we can start by telling participants a little bit about yourself and the initiative in Sierra Leone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diane. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to the colleagues on the call. My name is Wycliffe Ngwabe. I'm currently the country lead of UNCDF based out of Freetown in Sierra Leone. I've been in Sierra Leone for close to 2 years, and if you would allow me, probably I could share some of the market constraints in Sierra Leone at the moment. So Sierra Leone, compared to other countries in the region, has one of the least basic literacy levels. Only 59, just under 60% of adult females are literate, and the overall literacy level is under 40%. And they constitute around 70% of the workforce within agriculture, which is, I think, not very different from other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. When it comes to financial inclusion, under 25% have a formal account in any form of financial institution. So it tells you how dire the situation is, and hence the need for digital financial services. Current policies some of them actually do not favor the women. So we've seen shrinking civic space for women within Sierra Leone, most especially when it comes to enactment of policies and regulation. And I think it's just in order that we keep pushing to make sure that the women are included and their voices are listened to. And because of this, UNCDF is launching a big program, just under $20 million, to basically look at how we can address some of these market constraints, and most especially access to finance for women enterprises within agriculture. What I forgot to mention earlier on is food insecurity in the country just hit 64% of the population, which is a little bit very high, and the country at the moment spends around $200 million, over $200 million to import basic foodstuffs. So the intervention that we are working on is basically looking at how we can empower women enterprises to contribute to the economic development of the country, but also empower them to have a voice. You know, poverty is bad. When you're poor, you don't see meaning in life. So over to you, Diana. Thank you.
Thank you. I have so many questions. And I think I would like to structure the questions in a way that mirrors the way the playbook is organized, going directly to some very specific market constraints. You touched upon some of the overarching ones, but related to women's access to financial services and digital tools. I think we talked about in the case of the project, we will try to address constraints in the area of infrastructure, policy and regulation, and innovation. So maybe I can just, we can go one by one and learn a little bit more about the constraint itself and the types of interventions that you're thinking about. So in the area of infrastructure, I know you had mentioned that two main ones are related to gender gap in IDs and also gender gap in mobile phone ownership. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that and the types of interventions you're considering.
Absolutely, Diana. So like I mentioned earlier, the project goes beyond just finances and is also looking at empowering women by coming up with innovative infrastructure services. For example, phone ownership in the country, smartphone ownership in the country is under 20%. And of course, if you don't have a smartphone, then access to the digital economy becomes a little bit of a challenge. So the program is looking at designing a PEGO phone solution for the country, and with a specific emphasis on women. And that solution will basically be looking at increasing smartphone penetration in the country. The idea is, how do we move away from feature phones? Of course, with a feature phone, you can access some of the basic things, but if you need to access information that links you to the digital economy, then you need a smartphone. In as far as identity is concerned, Sierra Leone doesn't have a national ID as we speak. And it is a big issue when it comes to KYC, the know your customer requirement. In fact, because of this, we've been looking at quite a number of interventions. One is the launch of the National Digital ID platform that we've been working on for quite some time, but also we'll continue to support it. The second one has a lot to do with the policy component, working with the regulator to come up with a tiered KYC regime, so that as many people at the bottom are included in the form of financial services fold.
Thank you. And what about the constraint, the key constraint, or one of the key constraints related to policy and regulation? You had mentioned that women are underrepresented in many of the, the circles that could make decisions and make change or contribute to change. What can you tell us a little bit more about the market constraint itself and the types of interventions that you're designing or already thought about?
Absolutely, then. So, like I mentioned earlier on, the shrinking civic space for women, and women need to be empowered to contribute to policy formulation because policy affects everything, including business. So, working closely with our major partner, that is the Central Bank, Bank of Sierra Leone, we've been working on the consumer protection guidelines, and this is after realizing that one of the major reasons for low financial inclusion in the country is because the general population does not have confidence in the financial system. So how do we create that confidence then? Then we supported the central bank to come up with the consumer protection guidelines. But in order to include women voices, we had to go around the country listening to different women groups, women support organizations to just make sure that their voices are also taken care of. So for me, this sets a very good precedent of how women voices can be included in the enactment of policies and regulations, most especially those that affect their ways of living.
Thank you. And when you say women's voices, you're referring to their specific concerns, fears, and I guess where they have been burned before in relationship to accessing and using financial services, so that those are incorporated in the consumer protection
Absolutely.
guidelines.
So the general norm has been for people who have worked with regulators, most of the regulations are done in the boardroom. And without dialogue between the private sector and the regulator, or the consumers and the regulator, at times most of the policies are misplaced. So the idea of having everybody included in the process of enacting these policies, I think is a very good example of what we are trying to do in the country.
Great. We'll be looking out for specific examples of how those voices translated into the consumer protection principles, because I think this is a big area of interest in many other markets. So specific examples of this would be super helpful when you have them. And then moving to the really big constraint related to innovation, limited access to finance for women-owned or women-led businesses, small businesses. Is there anything you can share on that front? I know all of these are related. You know, the ID with access to smartphones, which brings you access to the digital platforms, representation. But I know you have a few more things to share that are specific to this lack of access for women business owners.
Exactly, Diana. So, like I mentioned earlier in the beginning, and maybe during the introduction, women enterprises have very low capacity, and most of them actually are informal in nature. Like any other country in the sub-Saharan Africa, the informal sector in this country is just above 50%, which is a little bit awkward. So it's very, very difficult for even the government to mobilize resources with such a big informal sector. So quite a number of interventions that we're actually looking at. One of them is, how do we support women enterprises to have access to concessional lines of credit? Average interest rate in the market, if you look at MFIs offering between 33 to 37%, and then the commercial banks go for as high as 27%, average of 25. With these, most of the women enterprises will never be able to have access to those finances. So how do we then come up with a product that can be presented to the market specifically for women and the youths, of course, without maligning the men, but supporting the women to be empowered so they can contribute to the economic development of the country. Like I mentioned earlier, 30% of them actually, 70% are involved in agriculture. And because of that, they actually end up being peasants. So how do we transform them from peasantry farming to mechanized farming? And also looking at value addition for most of the products that they produce. So a lot of interventions around that. Of course, you cannot have access to finance for women enterprises without addressing other underlying issues like identity, access to funds, access to internet, access to information, and a lot more of these. And for me, the playbook is a very great tool. I wish I had this earlier on, probably.
Nandini too, when she was working in Zambia.
Yeah, absolutely, and congratulations to the team for this. This is a great tool, and I would encourage everybody to make proper use of it.
And thank you so much for that prompt, Wycliffe. Actually, it's a great segue to our next section. I'll ask my colleague Rose to pull up the slides again, where this slide summarizes the market constraints that we just discussed and the interventions that Wycliffe has shared. And then on the next few slides, we have again a snapshot from the playbook on how to address this last constraint that we discussed. And I think in fact we have about 9 or 10 different types of interventions that are described in the playbook that participants can take a look at, and the resources shared. But Wycliffe, specifically, are there any within the interventions included in the playbook to address the limited access to finance for women-owned enterprises? Are there any that maybe you will contemplate, something that you haven't shared yet that you might be thinking about implementing, or ones that are listed here that would not make sense in the context of Sierra Leone? Because I think it's equally important to make sure that as practitioners, we take inspiration and lessons learned from other contexts, but we always have to contextualize and ensure that what we're designing, what we're thinking about implementing, is very relevant in the markets that we're working.
Absolutely, Diana. So for me, I think this particular playbook, the whole slide speaks to exactly the constraints in the market. So this one now helps me to go specifically to what interventions that we are designing for the Sierra Leonean market. So connecting women-owned SMEs to grants, loans, and guarantees. Like most of us might be aware, UNCDF is one of the 2 UN agencies with a special capital mandate to work with the government and the private sector. So we support SMEs with direct access to finance by designing innovative financial instruments, and grants being one of them. I know most of the people know UN for grants, but I think there's need now to start looking at other innovative financial instruments that can support the growth of SMEs. In Sub-Saharan Africa, the SME sector is a huge growth sector. It can contribute to job creation for the many unemployed youths in the country. So this particular one speaks to what I just explained. That is number one. Number two is driving the focus on women-owned enterprises through product innovation and technical assistance. I mean, when you speak to most financial service providers, they do not understand the needs of the women. For those that understand, do not fully understand actually. So the idea of supporting them through technical assistance to make sure that they provide products that are gender specific for women, I think it's an area that needs to be given a lot of emphasis. And then the third one, alternative financing models that do not require collateral. If a woman enters a bank and is asking for a loan, the issue of subjectivity sets in. So working on different scoring mechanisms that use algorithms that can support women access to financial services, I think would be an area. And basically, this particular program that I'm talking about is supporting one of interventions related to that. Mitigating the risks, perpetuating gender bias, and all these are basically have a lot to do with the use of digital to make sure that gender bias is actually dealt with. And probably the next slide has quite a few of the other constraints that I may feel may not be very, very applicable to the market. For example, number 5, Sierra Leone, besides being 60% an Islamic country, Islamic banking has not really taken off. For quite a number of reasons, the regulatory space has not been very enabling. Of course, that calls for a lot of support from development partners like ourselves, and it's an area that we have picked interest in with the central bank to see how we can create an enabling environment for Islamic finance, which has actually been praised to do wonders across the country. Then number 7, UNCDF cannot buy equity in these SMEs. However, the best we can do is to create an environment where these SMEs have access to equity, linking them to investors that are interested in buying equity. I think is an area that we can play. The convening role of the UN, I think, comes in quite very handy. And as we design our program, I think these 2 areas are the ones that we'll be seeking to pilot and see how to support the country on.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up an important point. I think I started by saying that not all interventions are applicable in all contexts, but not all interventions are also applicable based on what type of institution you are and what type of stakeholder, or what type of role you play in the market. So you made an important point that UNCDF cannot provide equity, maybe others can, but it's important to not only adapt the intervention to the context, but also to how your institution, what's the best role that your institution can play. Thank you so much for all of these examples. And I know you're just launching this initiative and you already have such a range of interventions and ideas and things that you want to implement. But I also know that we would like to tap into the collective power of the participants who joined us today through a participatory exercise to get more ideas on 2 of the things that you've already touched, two of the challenges that you've already touched in through your examples. One is, what are some ways that we can increase alternative or non-collateral based lending to women, and solutions that participants have seen work in addressing KYC requirements for women. So I would like to invite our participants to click on the link that was just shared in the chat. It's a link to a document where we can start sharing ideas on these 2 questions that, and Wycliffe, I'll turn it over to you to maybe guide the participants a little bit as they're entering their ideas on these 2 questions. Mm-hmm.
Wycliffe, I'll also help organize them into areas as previously discussed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So thank you, Dan, and thank you, Nandini, for this. I think to the participants, there's a link that has been shared in the chat. Feel free to open it, and it should lead you to this particular page. There are 2 questions. Question number 1 is, what are ways we can increase alternative or non-collateral based lending to women? I would like to pick some of your brains on this, and your ideas may not be applicable to Sierra Leone. They may be applicable, but for as long as they're applicable to your country, then it makes us to start thinking that yes, what we are preaching is the right gospel. Then the second question is, what solutions have you seen in addressing requirements, in addressing KYC requirements for women? And here, of course, I see some of you have already started actually populating some of these ideas, I think. Well done. There's a question that was posed earlier on. What are we doing in particular to make sure that the ID systems are gender specific? Of course, like I mentioned, some of these things have to be intentional. As we design the programs, we know that digital identity may not be the most favorable for a context like Sierra Leone, But we need to empower the women as well. The reason we're actually pushing for smartphone penetration so that as many people can have access to the digital economy. And thank you so much for those that are populating. Let's keep populating this. Nandini?
Yes, Wycliffe, we've got some really interesting ideas. There's a couple different ways that people are talking about tiered KYC, as you mentioned. Someone's just brought up digital ID, which I know you've got some experience with that you may want to talk about. And then some great ideas on alternative. And you specifically asked that we use the verbiage alternative or non-collateral based, because sometimes, especially in a traditional financing system, there has to be some collateral, but maybe it's some form of alternative collateral. Someone wrote something around movable collateral. There's a lot of movements around that as well. Yeah, Wycliffe, take a look at some of the, this is great. People are really, jewelry, collateral-based lending. Is that something you think would be relevant for Sierra Leone? What do you think, Wycliffe?
Yeah, sure. Actually, including the movable collateral, together with IFC, we are supporting the central bank, Bank of Sierra Leone, to work on collateral registry to recognize movable collateral. So yeah, this is quite very interesting. I'm looking at psychometric credit scoring models. We've seen most of these actually work very well in the East African market. That's in Kenya, Tanzania, and a lot more in Rwanda, Uganda as well. So I think these are very interesting ideas. Equal access to affordable energy. Yeah, I like the component of affordable energy. Of course, if you're talking about alternative collateral and access to finance without energy, it becomes almost not something that is very good. On the ID side, digital identification, yeah, biometric, digital ID again. Then enable access to entry-level mobile money accounts. Yes, of course, digital financial services through the phone.
Wycliffe, we've got, I'm trying to also help group them so it's not super overwhelming, but you've got a lot around, oh, I can use a pen here, around the use of financial history for collateral, right? Transaction-based lending, which, you know, of course, has a lot of positives and can be a game changer. But also, you know, we also have to be careful from the lessons that we're learning from East Africa. So yeah, and then we've got stuff around savings groups models and cooperative models. Wow, people are just putting more and more ideas out here. Is there anything in here surprising to you? Anything you didn't really think about before? Or, you know, like for example, when we have movable collateral, but we don't have much around gold-based lending or jewelry. As collateral in the playbook. Is there anything that surprises you here?
I think the gold-based lending in Turkey is one of those that I would pick a lot of interest in to see how it works. But the rest of these, we've seen a lot of them actually work in within Africa, most especially East Africa and the other side of the world, that is in China. There are quite a number of these innovations that are actually picking and working very well. Then P2p lending, I think this has really taken off so well in China. But of course, psychometric scoring and digital lending has its own downfalls. But it's a very good way of dealing with gender bias kind of assessments when it comes to access to finance for women.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for the great input into this exercise. Lots of good ideas and things that Wycliffe is already addressing in different ways. So thank you again. And I see the chat is exploding with questions and comments, and we'll have time to address a few of them. And Wycliffe, we're going to put you on the spot again because they're coming at you, the questions. And one question I see is related to affordability. And you had mentioned that that's one of the, you know, the cost, the interest rate of those lines of credit and other financial products you've mentioned are quite prohibitive for women. But affordability per se doesn't seem to be spelled out as a constraint in the playbook. That's one comment that we got, but also a very specific question from Getane related to the fact that digital services were hoped to help reduce the transaction cost, both for service providers and clients. And Nandini, I see you have something to say about that?
I just want to, I mean, I'd like to Wycliffe to talk about his vision for how to address that in terms of mobile phone access. But I think how we try to talk about things where, well, what's the constraint? Women don't have access to phones. And then what are different interventions to address those constraints, right? And so there's a great paper from GSMA that we put in there. That's a great reference tool that gives 6 different ways to help increase access, including different financing mechanisms. And so we tried to take that kind of framework. Over to you, Wycliffe, to talk about your vision.
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. While we may emphasize technology as one of the solutions to solve the access to finance question, I think there are quite a number of other things that need to first be addressed. And of course, I've read some of the research papers, most especially one that was published, I think 2 years ago in South Africa. There are those infrastructural issues that need to first be addressed, but also distribution. So we can leverage technology to improve distribution of financial services. If you have to walk 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers to get an access point, then of course that is already a barrier. So how do we then leverage technology to reduce, to increase access? Then leveraging technology to reduce, also improve on affordability. Affordability is kind of a very difficult task to address, because some of these are actually linked to the macroeconomic issues. Without addressing macroeconomic issues, it just becomes almost impossible to address affordability issues in some markets. All of us probably could know that interest rate sometimes is closely related to the price indices or index of the country. And if you have inflation in double digits, you cannot expect a financial service provider to set the interest rate below inflation. So a number of things that need to work hand in hand, and the reason UNCDF uses a market development approach, addressing all these constraints at the different levels of the markets, at the macro level, working with the regulators and the authorities to make sure that the right business environment is in place. At the macro, at the meso level, working with the providers, providing them with technical assistance through human-centric design approaches to make sure that they understand the market that they're addressing. If it is gender specific, what are exactly the needs of the women? We saw this in PNG with Mama Bank, trying to address issues of access to finance for women, and how this is a success story across the world. Then with the consumers themselves, understanding what is it that is preventing the consumers from getting access. Is it an issue with digital literacy, financial literacy, or is it an issue of information and that kind of thing? So it's a whole package, but I must again emphasize that there's no silver bullet. All these are interventions that we are trying to make sure that we improve the situation the way it is.
Thank you, Wycliffe, and you touched upon a few of the other questions that were posed in the chat, and I'm sorry to say we may not have time for one more, but there's a really interesting one that is asking what is the process of including women's voices and perspective into the design of the interventions. I think we talked about including these voices into the consumer protection principles, and you have mentioned right now that their experience should be considered in the design, but the how it's very important. So I would encourage all of us to think about this aspect, which is extremely important. And I would like to promise that we will take a look at all these questions and send written answers in our follow-up email. We will share, again, the playbook. We will share the recording, the slides, and responses to these questions in a follow-up email. In the interest of time, we will not answer any more questions live because I would like to invite my colleague Antonique to do a quick wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes. She's very good at that, even though we promised her a little bit more time. But it was a really engaging discussion, and I think it was important to allow this time for the exchange that we've had. So thank you to all of the participants and to you, Wycliffe, because you were on the spot for quite a bit. Thank you, Antonique.
Thanks so much, Diana, and thank you all. What a rich exchange and discussion. I mean, I've tried to follow the chat. I think there's lots of ideas. I mean, Herbert commented that there are actually very common constraints across emerging markets. And I think what Wycliffe has presented is just in one context, but there are a lot of similarities. And that, I think, makes the playbook so great. It starts from constraints. Wherever you are, analyze, of course, your context, diagnose the situation, but then use the tools in the playbook to inspire you and to search for responses and ideas that can help you design interventions. So I really hope that all of you are inspired by this to dig in and learn more. And secondly, and Mariana has already started, which I think is fantastic. This is a living document. The idea is that we together as a community of financial inclusion practitioners build on this, add more examples, be it failures or successes. Let's share so that all of us learn from it. And when we are trying to do something new in a different context, can actually leverage the experience of others. So thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for being part of this movement, which started today with the Generation Equality Forum. And I hope that we can really make sure that commitments are translated into action on the ground and to really make a difference for women that we care about. So thank you all for joining us today. And I'm sure you'll find your way to UNCDF and FinEquity to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.